Thanks for tuning back into the Conservation Podcast here at Pike County Conservation District. Today we're going to be talking about the link between our geology and groundwater systems in Pike County. And to help me with that, I have our watershed specialist, Rachael, as well as Kurt Wagner, who is here with us from Pennsylvania Rural Water. All right, so we've got Rachael Marques here, who's our watershed specialist at the district, and Kurt from PA Rural Water. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Anytime.
Absolutely.
Cool. So could you tell us a little bit about what PA Rural Water is to start off and what you do?
Sure, yeah. Pennsylvania Rural Water Association is actually it's a nonprofit membership organization. So our membership is made up of community water systems and wastewater systems, and then any associate members like engineers or technical service providers that would support that industry. One of our main focuses is training for operators, and then we also focus on on-site assistance for systems.
Awesome. So let's dive right into the relationship between geology and groundwater. So this year, our topic for our education is hydrogeomorphology. So we already talked a little bit about how geology and waters interact, and now we're going to talk specifically about geology and groundwater. So can we talk a little bit about why different kinds of soils and rocks have different levels of permeability, or how different rocks allow more or less water to infiltrate into the ground?
Sure, yeah. So when we're talking about soil, it's important to know the depth of soil until you hit bedrock, and then what that soil is made up will affect permeability. So permeability, we'll define that as how easily water can flow through the soil. We could also talk about porosity. Porosity is how much open or void space there is between the particles of soil. So it's important as well because that tells us how much water the soil can hold. So when we talk about porosity, things like how the soil is graded, if you think of a bowl of marbles, that's the example I'll use. And if every marble was the same size, it would leave a lot of space between the marbles. If you had an equal portion of 5 different sizes of marbles, the smaller marbles and the larger marbles would help fill some of that space. We can also talk about the shape of the soil. So some soils, like clays, would be more of a flake, or they'd be a flatter shape, and they can lay more tightly together, so it allows less void space between the particles. We could also talk about organic matter. So organic matter really helps soil structure. It makes it, if you could say, it makes it fluffier, right? So it also does a good job of holding more water in the soil as well. So that's one of the reasons it's great for your plants, great for biological life. And then also, it's important to talk about compaction. So even if soil is well graded, it has lots of space, or if it's gap graded, it has even more space. If it's highly compacted, think of any other illustration where you press something together, you're pressing a lot of the open space out of the soil. So again, it's the structure of the soil, and then also the makeup and the types of particles and how well they're graded that allows different amounts of permeability.
Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Rachael?
Yeah, I mean, for Pike County specifically, we're very lucky that we have a lot of very rocky soils that's a little bit looser, very well drained as compared to some other potential soil types and particle sizes and such. So we are very fortunate that we do have a lot of that well drained. But yeah, I would just second what Kurt said about the different factors that play into how well our soil is going to be permeable, or and that'll affect, again, like our recharge areas, so places that are really important for Pike County residents. Pike County is dependent upon groundwater as our source of all of our, most of our water uses, mainly drinking water and water in our homes. So those recharge areas and that well-drained soil is really important for us in Pike County specifically, as it helps us bring more water back down into our aquifers for us to use in the future. And that's why permeability and the porosity is really important, especially for systems like Pike County that depend on groundwater.
Yeah, and we had talked in the last episode too about how even though Pike County is a relatively small geographic area, there's all sorts of different kinds of geology and soil structures that we have just in the county, depending on if you're near the water gap or if you're more closer to the center of the county. So most of the soils here are well draining, but they are all a little bit different. So there's different levels of permeability spread throughout the county too.
Yeah, and we've seen that a lot even with our groundwater monitoring program that we have in partnership with USGS. And you can see it on a lot of maps, and we can attach one with this podcast as well. But just how we do have different types of aquifers here in Pike County. We do have a lot of areas of like glacial influence and glacial till, and then we also have areas of like sandstone influence, and that can affect the yields of the well, but then also the recharge rates and how they behave in different situations like post rainstorm and stuff like that. And we've seen that in our USGS groundwater level monitoring program. USGS has been able to point out over the last several years that the program has been going on some different trends in different areas of the county as we monitor the ground level and how that changes.
Yeah, a great resource for landowners to discover the type of soil on their property would be the USDA Soils Map, which is a publicly available GIS platform. So you can access it by simply searching for it on any search engine, and you can zoom into your property, and it will actually produce soil reports for the types of crops or trees or whatever you're looking for. It also will explain things like infiltration rates, so how easily water will go into the ground after a rainstorm.
Yeah, and that's a really great resource that we use a lot here at the district that our technical staff use for our erosion sediment control programs and stormwater management as well. So lots of good info on there for sure. So one of the main geologic features that we have here are definitely the Pocono Mountains. So we see sometimes groundwater seeps happening on mountains. So how does that happen?
Yeah, I think an easy way to visualize this would be looking at cut banks. So areas where the mountain has been cut away for the construction of a road, oftentimes in the winter, we'll see areas where there's ice forming on the side of the hill. And that's really that seep, which is not freezing when it's in the ground because of the insulation that the ground provides. It's freezing when it enters into the air and flows out the side of the mountain. So if you think of a slushy, this is my go-to way of thinking of groundwater. I love blue raspberry slushies, that's my favorite, but if you fill a slushie with juice, it will eventually fill up all of the spaces between the particles of ice in the slushie. The height of where all the particles are filled, that layer would be considered the water table in this example. So if you elevate or if you angle the slushy surface as rain infiltrates into the ground, it goes into the mountain and it's going to start flowing in every direction, or it's going to flow down, quote, hill or down energy gradient. So if the water table is slanted less than the surface of the hill and it eventually intersects that surface, it simply flows out of the hill. There could also be something like an aquiclude or an aquitard. So maybe there's a layer of clay below the water table, and that actually acts as a confining layer, and it forces the water to flow along that layer, and it would just direct it to the side of the hill to flow out the side.
That's so cool. And then that's how we see kind of like frozen water seeping out of mountainsides that you might even see just along highways or roads sometimes. So we know that our groundwater is flowing through mountains, flowing through the ground, and as it comes in contact with all of these different soils and rocks underground, that the types of the soils that we have can affect the quality of the groundwater, right?
Yeah, soil and rock can affect. So different, you have to think that the rock that's under our feet is typically in this area, especially it's sedimentary. So it was deposited. It might have higher percentages of organic matter, which will influence the water quality. And different types of rock might be more or less reactive. Other things that can affect it are things like groundwater pH. Low pH can actually cause more contamination or cause other chemicals or other minerals to be extracted, we'll use that term, from the rock. The amount of oxygen in the groundwater can have an effect on that. Alkalinity can have an effect. So maybe a good example, I know that in the past I've heard about sulfur being a concern, or sulfur smell. So for example, sulfur can just be a result of dissolved minerals. It can also be a result of the oxidation of different minerals. So if you have large quantities of pyrite, or if you have deposits or interbedding of gypsum or some other material, that can actually cause higher sulfides. You can also have hydrogen sulfate formed because of sulfur-reducing bacteria, which is a lot less common. And in very high quantities, it can be a concern. Typically, it's never a concern. So again, this is very localized. It could be a mile apart and have completely different groundwater quality. I'm working with a community water system that has 2 wells in the same bedrock formation. They're just a few hundred feet or less apart. One of the wells has high iron, high manganese, it has iron bacteria, and the other well is completely fine. So again, underground rock can be folded. We could have fractures where water flows more quickly, and it's very hard to figure out where that water is coming from and where it's going unless we drill many, many holes to discover that. But again, the reactivity of the rock in the ground has a dramatic effect on the quality of the water. Non-reactive, an example of that might be something like sand, something that has a high silica content because, again, it's very stable, has a very neutral pH. If you have a well that has a very neutral pH, it's very soft water, it's probably an indicator that there's a lot of sandstone under your property where that well is drilled.
I would second that, and also just mention that, as Kurt had said, a lot of it can be pretty spotty. Your neighbor could have different water quality than you may have, and that's kind of also why it's important that you test your well. You want to make sure that even if your neighbor's water is okay, maybe you want to just double check what might be going on in your well. Again, these wells are drilled potentially hundreds of feet down below the surface and into different pockets of geology. So just being sure that you're checking what's going on in your particular well is helpful, because again, you could have high iron and your neighbor could have totally fine water. And that's an issue that is kind of relatively common here in Pike County. So we've heard a lot of people mention high iron in their wells, or maybe things like manganese is pretty common. And then I know down in certain areas of the county, there's also pockets of arsenic in the water. And so it's just good to pay attention. Again, the geology and the pH does have a big effect on that, but just pay attention to kind of the quality as well.
If you go, there's a really interesting study from 2007, some of the levels that you can see across the county. So this is a survey of private and public wells or community wells, and the low pH was 5.7, the median was 6.8, and the maximum was 8.3, which is a pretty significant range for just one county. So it gives you an idea that from one place to the next, there can be significant differences in groundwater quality.
Yeah, definitely. So we already talked about groundwater seeps in the sides of mountains and how that can cause the groundwater to come up to the surface, but there's also something called an artesian well where we see groundwater coming up to the surface as well. So could you talk a little bit about what that is and what would cause that?
Sure. Many of you have probably dove in the deep end of a pool before, and you'll notice when you're at the bottom of the pool, there's a lot of pressure on your ears specifically, a very sensitive part of our body. So the cause of an artesian well, which first of all, artesian wells don't necessarily have to surface, but it just means that the borehole, as it's drilled, when you hit the water table, water will actually rise at some point into the borehole. So it's under some amount of pressure. So hydrostatic pressure would be the term for that. Just like being at the bottom of a swimming pool allows a higher pressure because of all of the water being acted on gravity, and then also the mass of the water pressing on you, the same thing can happen underground. So we can have areas underground where you have very permeable rock, very unconsolidated material, and below and above that you might have a consolidated or a solid layer of something like shale, where water doesn't easily pass through. So what it does, it actually traps that water, and if it would be put on its side, it allows the water to flow and continue to flow until it can't flow anymore. At the bottom of that aquifer, if you're imagining something maybe at a 45-degree angle that's confined on the top and the bottom of that aquifer would be under additional pressure other than just atmospheric pressure. You can maybe think of, if you've ever done the experiment with a bottle, where let's say I have a 2-liter bottle and I poke 3 holes in the bottle. The bottom hole would actually have more pressure, the flow of water would go farther. If you go another inch or two higher, it would have less pressure, and so on and so forth as we go farther up the bottle. So if you drill a well through that confining top layer of an aquifer that's confined, as you drill that well, the water is going to want to rise into your well or your borehole to equalize the pressure at the top of that confined aquifer. So if it would happen to be that the top of that confined aquifer was at the high part of a mountain with outcropping, that water may actually flow all the way out of the borehole into the land surface and create what we would think of as an artesian flow.
That is so cool. We talked a little bit about how groundwater follows the surface of the bedrock or whatever that confining layer of the aquitard is, and you had said how it could be tilted not directly with the slope of the landscape. So then we can end up having groundwater flowing uphill, right? Underground?
Well, I think that's a weighted question, so
Okay.
I'll take a step back. So
Okay.
to say that groundwater, I guess it can flow in a vertical direction would be a good way to think about that. So underground, again, bedrock layers of strata between rock, they can be folded and they can be bent in a lot of different strange directions. So if you ever heard of an anticline would look like a rainbow of different layers of rock. A syncline would look like an upside down rainbow of rock. So again, depending on the strata, the incline or the dip of the rock, if it's confined, it could push water in the upward direction against the flow of gravity, if you will. Another thing that we could look at is capillary action. So if you ever looked at a beaker or a glass, you'll notice that the water, it seems to want to rise up the sides. And that's because the surface tension or the cohesion of the water to the glass is greater than the internal cohesive force of the water itself. So you can actually, because of small fissures or small fractures in rock, you can experience capillary action where water will actually rise up cracks and it will appear to be defying gravity, but it's because of an imbalance of forces inside the water, between the water molecules, and between the water and the rock itself.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No comment.
No comment. So instead of flowing maybe uphill, it'd be better to say, I think you phrased it that it's flowing maybe against the direction of gravity.
Yes, yep. So if you look at water on the land surface, it always seems to flow in the direction you expect it to. It flows downhill. And that's because if you look at gravity as part of the transfer of energy, it's a down energy gradient, or down a potentiometric gradient would be a fancy way of saying it. So water always flows from high to low pressure would be another way of thinking of it. It's just the same as if you pump up your tire. The air is going to leak out of the hole because the pressure inside your tire is greater than the pressure outside. So if water becomes trapped and the height of the water it starts to accumulate, you have pressure head, elevation head, or hydrostatic pressure, and it's going to want to escape. So if there's a way for it to escape, it's going to push out of cracks, it's going to push out of areas where there's a path for transmissivity or for flow.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's a good image too with the tire pressure to visualize. So Rachael had mentioned before that all of Pike County relies on groundwater for the water that comes out of our taps, but lots of other places rely on surface waters or reservoirs. So how does the community determine if they're going to use groundwater or a surface water like that for their tap water needs?
Sure. I thinking through this, I thought of really three different concepts to think about. So number one, you have to have enough water, right? So if your groundwater aquifers don't produce enough water for the population of your community, that's not a viable source. And you can also look at the cost. If you do have viable groundwater sources, groundwater is typically cheaper to produce for community water systems because it doesn't always require filtration. So it's a lot less cost in treatment. And then also proximity, right? We have to be close enough. If you look at it on a really big scale, a community that would not be a viable community for groundwater, you might think of somewhere like New York City, right? This is a great segue for source water protection because what we do on the land surface can affect the quality of our groundwater. If we have a spill, if we have some type of a contamination, it will eventually go into our groundwater. It might be a soluble substance and it becomes part of the water, it's dissolved. It might be insoluble and it floats, sinks, or is buoyant, whatever you want to look at there. But just inferring, I've never seen any groundwater quality measurements or tests from New York City. I don't think I'd want to drink groundwater from under the ground in New York. So they go far from the city and they use the Catskills and a few other areas. So again, it depends on the quality of the groundwater, the quantity of the groundwater, and if you don't have those two aspects of groundwater available, and if you don't have any close enough, you may have to rely on a surface water body. So typically you're going to see larger cities. Some areas in Pennsylvania, the city of Erie, for example, uses Lake Erie as their drinking water source. They use very large nanofiltration plants. When you look at cities like Allentown, Bethlehem uses a very well protected surface water source, but Allentown actually does use groundwater sources in karst or limestone aquifers. So it varies from community to community. In Pike County, I think slightly because there aren't any highly urbanized large areas, even though you do typically have lower quantity yielding wells, it's still sufficient for the communities that need water as a whole.
That makes sense. The population here is definitely less than in places like Erie and Allentown. But even as we are pulling water out of the aquifer, it does get recharged by the rainwater infiltrating into it, right? So that's kind of how we still have water coming out of our taps even as we continue to use it, even though we have a relatively low groundwater supply in Pike County. And if you were looking at the question from the last newsletter about how much rainwater infiltrates into Pennsylvania aquifers annually, the answer to that is 13 inches of water infiltrate into our Pennsylvania aquifers each year.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Rachel?
No, Kurt kind of touched on source water protection, and that's really important. And it's just good to note, even though we don't rely on surface waters here in Pike County, that surface waters come with their own set of vulnerabilities and issues, but groundwater does as well. And like Kurt had mentioned, one of the things that I like to mention and when I talk to people in the community is that just because our source of drinking water isn't visible, say like a lake, like Lake Scranton or something like that, doesn't mean it's immune to our actions. So as Kurt had mentioned, spills and things like that, there's still a level of stewardship involved with our groundwater resources and things to be aware of as we use this valuable resource.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the water infiltrates into the groundwater, it's not just the water itself. It can pick up stuff from impermeable surfaces like pavement and sidewalks, and it's also connected. Our groundwater aquifers are connected to the surface waters and whatever ends up in those as well. So it's all connected. So we talked about how there's several different aquifers in Pike County, and they all have different properties that make them each a little bit unique. But how big or small can one individual aquifer be?
That is a great question, and it would probably be a better question for a very highly trained professional geologist. However, if for example, if you go online and search for a geology map of Pennsylvania, you will see many strange shapes and colors because we have a very highly varied morphology in our geology. So because I like to call it fragmented, it's divided into so many small areas, and also because there are so many different morphologies in geology that can impede groundwater flow or cause it to move in directions we wouldn't expect, Pennsylvania has a lot of very small, considerably aquifers. So you might have a recharge area for a perched aquifer, for example. A perched aquifer would be open to groundwater infiltration from the land surface, but it would have a confining layer under it, where you could imagine putting a bowl in your garden and filling it up with soil, pouring water on top. The bowl will fill up in the soil, but then it will begin to overflow. It doesn't hold that much. So we might have aquifers that are just a few acres. In comparison, when you go to the Midwest, areas where there's a lot of, again, oftentimes unconsolidated glacial deposits, you can have aquifers that are hundreds and thousands of square miles, where the water typically flows and it mirrors the surface water flow of surface water for hundreds of miles without any impedance. Typically in Pennsylvania, larger aquifers would probably be associated with river valleys. Again, groundwater does typically mirror the direction and flow of surface water, just much slower, right? It could be inches or feet per year to a few thousand feet per day, and that would be in like a gravel or sand aquifer along a river valley. So those are typically larger. You also might see larger aquifers in areas that are carbonate, like karst topography. That would be in limestone and dolomite, and oftentimes they're in valleys that are divided by ridges, and they would follow a stream through that valley. But in Pennsylvania, aquifers are, I would say, smaller than many other areas because of those things.
So you had mentioned karst geology, and that's where we get our cave systems too, right? So kind of that same feature that we talked about in the last episode of how the limestone is more easily erodible and we get these big openings that form our cave systems. Would it be that it's more easily erodible by the groundwater, and so that's how we get like these larger pore spaces for the groundwater to flow through?
Absolutely. Yeah, so limestone can be jointed, so it can have a lot of fractures. That helps, right? Other more cracks in the limestone, but it also is, it has a high dissolution rate, so it dissolves easily in atmospheric conditions. And that's because it's made up of minerals like calcium and magnesium. I'm actually from closer towards central Pennsylvania. We have a lot of cave systems. We also have a lot of streams, several streams near my home that actually disappear. They're losing streams, so there's a dry stream bed. The stream flows, there is no stream, the stream reappears, and it's because of those. I had a chance to chat with a gentleman. He was the board member of a water system, and he talked about his father who worked at a limestone quarry, and they actually discovered the opening of a cave that connected to a stream that disappeared into the ground, and they discovered the underground flow. So you can imagine sinkholes, for example. That's an area where the limestone or goldstone has dissolved. It's been carried away by the groundwater as it flows, and the void that's left is so big that the ground above it can't be supported and it collapses into the hole. So you can have very large open areas underground. In fact, that would be one of the few cases where you might find an underground lake, and again, underground streams.
Yeah, that is so cool. Beautiful segue. Yeah, so that's a beautiful segue. I think a lot of people often think about groundwater as an underground lake or an underground stream, but we had already talked about how it's more just the small pore spaces in between the rock and the sediment particles, that it's almost like a sponge, the groundwater aquifer, where it's just little pockets in between pieces of rock rather than a large open space, except for those rare exceptions of something like a karst opening like that, like a sinkhole or a cave. So that underground lake is kind of a misconception or a myth that a lot of people have about groundwater. And Kurt and Rachel, you both interact with the public pretty often talking about our groundwater and source water protection. So are there any common myths that you come across, any kind of misunderstandings that seem to be widespread that you'd like to take this opportunity to debunk?
I mean, we've already touched on some, just like that underground lake mystery. But also the one that I like to touch on again is just that just because our groundwater is underground doesn't mean it's safe from all of our above ground activities, like I mentioned. One of the main ones that I get a lot is, well, my water tastes fine, so it must be good. But that's not necessarily true, right? So we have a lot of water quality issues that have no taste, no visible appearance necessarily. So things like E. coli bacteria, they don't typically have a taste or an odor, but they can cause a lot of gastrointestinal issues and illness. So that's one thing. Sometimes iron, I know personally, like my water tastes fine, but we do have like rust colored stains inside of our porcelain fixtures and stuff like that. So we do have a high iron, and it isn't a health issue, but it is something that could cause infrastructure problems later on. So just those types of issues aren't necessarily, just because we can't taste it or smell it, like we would maybe a sulfur issue. Doesn't mean it's not there. So that's why it's always important to be vigilant. And again, I'll say it till the cows come home, but get your water tested if you're not sure. Yeah, that's one of my main ones.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I concur.
Awesome. Yeah. Do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah.
You had some other. Sorry, I stole your.
No. I absolutely agree with Rachel. Most of the taste and odor issues in water are actually not a concern for contamination. Interestingly, so if you have elevated sulfates or sulfides, they're not typically at an unsafe level. Iron and manganese can cause taste and odor issues. I will say that people that are in a health-sensitive population, that might be a concern for them because of dissolved solids and how much is in the water, especially people that have kidney issues or any issue with filtering that water in their body. But typically, volatile organic chemicals, synthetic organic chemicals, nutrients like nitrate, they have no taste and no odor at levels that would be harmful in the water. I like to bait people into that sometimes to say, hey, I bet you probably taste a little bit of a difference in your water because it's high in nitrates. And they'll say, yes, absolutely. But again, nitrates are odorless, they're colorless, they're tasteless. Mm-hmm. And I'll do that in jest, and if I can do it tastefully and not insult them is what I would like to say. But I do it to make a point, and it's the same point that Rachel made, that we cannot discern most of the issues that water would have without many different highly developed tests and methodologies for detecting the quantity of those contaminants.
Yeah, so definitely getting your water tested about once a year is good practice. And if you go to the source water page on our website, pikeconservation.org, there is a list there of labs that are certified by the State Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, and also just good common practices for protecting our source water and keeping that groundwater resource nice and healthy for us to all use. So those are all the questions that I have for you today. Do either of you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I'll just shout out again our USGS groundwater level program. Currently, for the last couple months, Pennsylvania has been in and out of some drought watches, some drought warnings, and our groundwater program helps inform those declarations. So please visit our website. That data is available online for Pike County. You can interact with any of the wells that we monitor regularly, see how they're doing in comparison to the normal averages and stuff. It's a very important program as we move forward and as we continue to develop in Pike County, just making sure that we're aware of our groundwater levels as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything to add, Kurt?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat and interact with the folks and the citizens of Pike County. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to serve and help out some of the community water systems that some of them may utilize for their drinking water.
Yes, definitely. Penn State Extension is also a really great resource to check out. And that is all we have today. So thank you for listening. And Rachel and Kurt, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your amazing knowledge on our Pike County groundwater. Thank you for listening to the Conservation Podcast here at Pike County Conservation District. If you enjoyed this episode and want to find more, you can find past episodes and new episodes on our website, pikeconservation.org, under the Education tab, or on Spotify. To stay in touch with us and find out more about our upcoming events, newly released podcast episodes, and tips and tricks for conservation at home, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and sign up for our email monthly newsletter, which you can find the sign up link at the bottom of our website, pikeconservation.org. Thanks for listening.